Welcome to our deep dive into the philosophy of death. It's a topic that most people try to avoid, but we're going to jump right in. We're going to explore some seriously fascinating, maybe even a little unsettling ideas. And we'll start with the very basics. What does it even mean to be alive? And how do we define death?
Yeah, those are great questions to kick things off with because it might seem like simple questions, but they kind of lead us down this philosophical rabbit hole. I mean, we often just assume that life and death are just like straightforward biological things, but when you really start digging in, you realize there's like layers of philosophical stuff going on.
Exactly. And that's where our source for this deep dive comes in, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, well, death. It lays out a whole bunch of theories about life, like vitalism, which argues that living things have this special substance or, a life force. But the encyclopedia it kind of quickly dismisses this idea, pointing out that there's just no scientific proof for this force.
Yeah, no, that's right. And then there's this idea that life is like just an event or a process that's just, unfolding over time. But even that idea kind of runs into some problems because it still depends on defining the property of being alive, which brings us to what the encyclopedia calls the compositional account of life.
Okay, the compositional accounts. What's that all about?
Well, it essentially says that living things have this unique ability to control like their own composition. It's kind of driven by the actions of their parts. So think of it like a car. Let's say a car that could repair itself. Just replacing worn out parts all on its own without any outside help. Living things are constantly, they're taking in energy and matter from their surroundings, of course, and they use that to maintain and repair themselves.
Okay, I like that. That's a good analogy. So it's not just about having certain parts, it's how those parts actively work together.
Exactly. And this whole self-modification thing, it's guided by information that's stored within the organism, like DNA. And that acts kind of like a blueprint for building and maintaining the whole living system.
So this capacity for self-directed change, that's what really sets the living apart from the non-living.
Yeah.
So that makes me think, if life is about this capacity, then death must be the loss of it.
Yeah, you got it. The encyclopedia calls this the loss of life account of death. And it's not just about, your heart stopping or your brain like shutting down. It's really about the irreversible loss of this ability to carry out those vital self-sustaining activities.
But hold on, does that bring up questions about things like frozen embryos or like organisms that are in suspended animation? Their vital activities are on hold, but we wouldn't call them dead.
Ah, that's a good point. That's where the difference between viable and vital is important. Something can be viable, meaning it has the potential for life, without actually being vital or, actively living right at this moment. So a frozen embryo, for example, is viable, and it's considered alive because it keeps the capacity to come back to return to a vital state.
So death is about the loss of that potential for life, that
Yeah.
viability. But the encyclopedia goes even further than that, right? It also gets into whether we just cease to exist when we die.
Right. And this is where we get into the whole Terminators versus anti-Terminators debate. Terminators think that death is like annihilation. You're just gone, game over. Anti-Terminators, on the other hand, they say that something of us might stick around even after death, even if it's just our physical remains.
So a Terminator would be like, lights out.
Yeah.
And an anti-Terminator might say the light bulb is still there, even if it's not emitting light anymore.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. And the encyclopedia points out that even the way we talk about it can be tricky. We say things like dead bodies, which kind of implies that there's some continued existence, right? But we also talk about people who died centuries ago as dead, even though there are no physical remains left.
Okay, so this is getting pretty complicated already. But isn't there another layer to this? The whole question of uh, what makes a person in the first place?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is crucial because it influences how we understand the very nature of death itself. The encyclopedia outlines three main views: animalism, personism, and mineism. Animalism is probably the simplest. You are like essentially a human animal, and death is just when that animal stops existing.
Okay, so animalism, pretty straightforward. What about personism?
Personism focuses on our capacity for self-awareness.
Yeah.
It's the argument that what makes us persons is, that ability to think about ourselves, to have beliefs and desires, and to relate to the world in a conscious way. So death, for a personist, is the loss of this self-awareness.
So someone in a permanent vegetative state, they might be considered uh, dead by personists, even though their body is still functioning.
Yeah, that's one possible implication of personism. And then there's mindism, which takes it even further and defines us as mind. So death, for a mindist, is the end of the mind's existence.
So we have all these different ways of thinking about what a person even is, and it seems like these different types of death, they could actually happen at different times.
That's exactly what the encyclopedia is getting at. Imagine someone has a severe brain injury, and it totally destroys their capacity for self-awareness. A personist, they might say that person is dead, even though their body is still alive. And a mindist could argue that their mind could stop existing even while their body is still going.
Wow, this is making my head spin a little bit. So depending on how we define person and death, the end of life becomes a much more nuanced, complex thing.
Yeah, and it leads to that big question, the one that often, drives a lot of our anxiety about death. Is death actually a bad thing for the person who dies? This is where the harm thesis comes in, and the encyclopedia, it actually dives into some pretty surprising arguments against it.
Okay, this is where I get really interested. So what are some of those arguments that death might not be bad for us? I mean, it seems pretty intuitive, right, that dying would be harmful.
I know, right? It seems kind of counterintuitive, but one of the most famous arguments against this whole harm thesis comes from this ancient Greek philosopher, Epicurus, and he was all about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain.
Okay, so how does pleasure and pain fit into all of this?
Well, Epicurus, he believed that good and bad are totally tied to our sensations. So pleasure is good, pain is bad. And, death is basically the deprivation of all sensation. So he argued that it can't bring us pleasure or pain.
So he's basically saying death can't harm us because, well, we can't feel anything when we're dead.
Exactly. He said that when we exist, death is not present. And when death is present, we don't exist. So therefore, it just can't harm us.
But wait a minute, isn't there a problem with that? What about the whole process of dying itself? Dying can be painful.
Yeah.
So wouldn't that be bad even for someone like Epicurus, a hedonist?
Yeah, and that's one of the weaknesses that the encyclopedia points out. The actual process of dying, especially if it involves suffering, it could be considered harmful,
Yeah.
even from a hedonistic point of view.
So even Epicurus, who, argued that death isn't actually harmful, had to admit that the process of dying, if it's painful, that could be bad. Seems like there are some holes in his argument. But the encyclopedia, it brings up even more challenges to this idea that death is bad, like this thing called harmless preclusion.
Right, harmless preclusion. It gets at this idea that not every single thing that stops us from having something good is automatically bad or harmful. The encyclopedia uses this example of, like, not being a genius. So objectively speaking, having a really high IQ, it could lead to, more achievements and opportunities. It could make your life better in lots of ways.
So, okay, then my lack of genius, that's a harm. I'm missing out on all those benefits.
Yeah, that's the question, right? But, most people wouldn't think about, like, their average intelligence as some huge misfortune. And this kind of points to a possible problem with the whole idea that death is harmful just because it deprives us of all these potential future good things. Because if we take that logic too far, then almost anything could be a harm, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a billionaire, so I'm missing out on all the cool stuff that comes with being rich, but does that mean I'm actually being harmed?
Okay, I see your point. So there's a difference between something being bad, like objectively bad, and it actually causing us harm.
Yeah.
But how do we explain why some things, like death, why does that feel so bad, while other stuff, like not being a genius, doesn't really bother us?
Yeah, well, the encyclopedia looks at a couple of possible explanations for that. One idea is that the harmfulness of something being taken away, it depends on how likely that good thing actually was. So death, it takes away stuff that was pretty much guaranteed, right? Like future experiences and relationships. But being a genius, that's a total long shot, so it doesn't really feel like a harm.
So maybe it's about how certain the loss is. Like death, it takes away things we were totally counting on. While not being a genius just means missing out on something that was never really going to happen anyway.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. The encyclopedia also says that the importance we put on something, on a specific good, might play a role too. There are things that are just so essential to our well-being, like our health or our loved ones, and their loss is always going to feel like a harm. But other things, like getting a certain job or winning the lottery, they're just not as central to who we are, to what makes life good.
This makes me think that our ideas about what's harmful, they're really shaped by our values and our experiences. But even if we just agree that death is bad, there's still that question of when that harm actually happens. We touched on this before, but the encyclopedia, It goes into a ton of different views on this, like concurrentism, priorism, subsequentism, and even a temporalism.
Right. It's like trying to, I don't know, pin jelly to a wall. It's super hard to figure out when death harms us. Concurrentism says it happens right at the moment of death, especially if it's, a painful death. But then how can death rob us of future stuff at the exact moment we die, when that stuff hasn't even happened yet?
It's like being robbed of a prize you haven't even won yet. How can you be harmed by losing something you didn't even have?
Exactly. And then there's priorism, which says death can actually harm us even before we die by, like, casting a shadow over everything we're doing now. Think about someone who gets a terminal diagnosis. Knowing that they're going to die, it can cause them a lot of suffering even before death itself.
So it's like we're being harmed by thinking about death, by knowing that our future is limited. It's like carrying this heavy weight around with us. But what about subsequentism? Doesn't that make things even weirder?
Oh, yeah, subsequentism gets really strange because it says death harms us after we're gone. The idea is that we're harmed during the time we would have been experiencing those future goods if we hadn't died.
Hold on. So if I die tomorrow, I'm being harmed next week because I'm missing out on all the good things that would happen to me. But I don't even exist anymore.
I know, right? Sounds crazy. And the encyclopedia admits that this view, it has some serious problems to deal with. Like, if death is really the end, how can we be harmed after we're gone? It's like trying to, punch a ghost.
So subsequentism, it runs into some metaphysical problems there. But the encyclopedia gives us one more option, right? Atemporalism.
Yeah, atemporalism tries to avoid this whole time travel thing that subsequentism runs into. It basically says that the harm of death, it exists, but it's outside of our normal way of understanding time. It's not that we're harmed at a specific moment, but that our life, like our whole life, is worse because it ends.
So it's like saying that, I don't know, a beautiful song is less valuable because it eventually ends. Even though there's no specific note where the harm actually happens, the harm is just that it can't go on forever.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. Atemporalism, it gets around the problem of figuring out the exact time of harm, but it does mean we have to accept that some harms exist outside of our normal ideas of time.
This whole thing about timing, it's so confusing. It really shows how much our understanding of harm is tied to our experience of time. But the encyclopedia doesn't just give us these, thought experiments. It also looks at some specific arguments against this whole harm thesis, like the symmetry argument that Lucretius came up with.
Oh, yeah, the symmetry argument, that's a classic. It basically says, look, we shouldn't fear death if we don't fear the time before we were born. Both states, they argue, are just the absence of experience.
But doesn't that miss something really important? Death, it cut short a life that was actually good. But prenatal non-existence, that just means life hasn't started yet. It's like comparing being disappointed because a concert ended early to never even having the chance to go to the concert at all.
Exactly. You hit on a key problem with the symmetry argument. Death and birth, they're just not the same. Birth makes life possible, but death ends it. And that ending, that's what feels bad.
It's the loss of potential, the interruption of something valuable. That's what makes death feel like a harm. Our prenatal non-existence, it doesn't have that. But the encyclopedia, it also looks at another version of this symmetry argument that focuses on extending life, not just non-existence.
Right. It asks, why do we have such a strong desire to live longer, to extend our lives into the future? But we wouldn't want to have always existed in the past. We want more time in the future, but who would actually want to have been alive forever?
That's a good question. It seems, I don't know, obvious that we want more time in the future.
Yeah.
But the idea of always having existed, that feels weird.
The encyclopedia suggests that maybe our preference for future life, it's connected to our nature as humans. We're always looking ahead. We have goals and stuff we want to do, and death gets in the way of that. Extending our lives into the past, that wouldn't give us more time to do those things because the past, it's already happened. We can't change it.
So it's not just about how much life we have. It's about the quality of that life. Yeah. And the ability to, make our future how we want it. We don't want to extend our past because we can't do anything about it. But this brings up another question. If death is bad because it, stops us from getting what we want, what about the stuff we want that happens after we're gone? This is where posthumous harm comes in, right?
Exactly. Posthumous harm, it's this really interesting idea that stuff that happens after we die can actually harm us.
But how is that even possible? We don't exist anymore, so how can anything hurt us?
It's a tricky one, right? Some philosophers say posthumous harm is impossible because it would need some kind of backwards causation. How can something in the future affect someone who's, not even there anymore?
Yeah, that does seem to go against everything we know about cause and effect.
Right. But others argue that, well, it's at least possible conceptually. They say that stuff happening after our death, it could affect the value of our whole life or, whether our desires were fulfilled. Imagine you really want your kids to be happy and successful. If something terrible happened to them after you die, wouldn't that, in a way, mean that your desire wasn't fulfilled?
I can see how that would be a type of posthumous harm. It's not that we're feeling the harm directly, but that our goals and our hopes, they're being messed with, even though we're gone. But this makes me wonder about, like, who we are, what makes us us, and if a desire can still be yours after you're gone.
Yeah, the encyclopedia doesn't give us any easy answers. It just shows the different arguments and lets us figure out what it all means. But there's one more twist, one more thing the encyclopedia adds to this whole discussion. Would living forever even be a good thing?
Okay, this is getting really interesting.
Yeah.
So even if we could, like, conquer death,
Hmm.
the encyclopedia says we might actually end up regretting it.
That's the argument that Bernard Williams makes. He says that living forever, it could lead to boredom and losing our sense of meaning. He talks about this character in a play called The Macropulos Case, who has lived for hundreds of years, and eventually she just doesn't care about anything anymore.
So the idea is that if we live long enough, we'll just, like, run out of things to be passionate about,
Hmm.
and we'll just be left with nothing to, I don't know, to work towards. It's like Groundhog Day, but like forever, just reliving the same stuff over and over until it means nothing.
That's the danger that Williams points out. He argues that as our desires fade away, so does our reason for living. We become less and less ourselves, and eventually we reach a point where existing just feels pointless.
But couldn't we avoid that by, like, changing our desires over time? What if we're constantly trying new things, exploring new interests? Wouldn't that keep things interesting and prevent us from getting bored with immortality?
That's what people usually say, right? Couldn't we just reinvent ourselves every once in a while? Like hitting the reset button on our lives to avoid boredom?
It's like being, I don't know, an existential tourist.
Yeah.
Always looking for new experiences, never settling down.
But Williams says that wouldn't really fix the problem. He thinks that for life to be worth living, it needs to be clearly me who's living it. So if we're always changing who we are, what we want, does that future self even count as the same me?
This brings up some huge questions about who we are, how much we can change and still be the same person. It's like that ship of Theseus thing, If you replace all the parts of a ship, is it still the same ship?
Exactly. And the encyclopedia also says that even if we could keep changing our desires, would those new desires even be really ours? Or would they just be a way to avoid being bored? We might end up just chasing new things just for the sake of it, without any real purpose.
So we'd be like trapped in this cycle of, like, existential consumerism, always needing something new just to avoid feeling empty. This makes me wonder if maybe being afraid of death is actually, a misplaced fear. Maybe what we're really afraid of isn't dying, it's living a life that has no meaning.
It's a powerful thought. And it leads us to the last point the encyclopedia makes. Is there anything we can do to, reduce the harm of death? If we say death is bad, are there things we can do to make it less scary, to be okay with it?
Now, this is what I really want to know. Is there some kind of, like, philosophical trick we can use to make death less scary?
Well, the encyclopedia talks about this idea of vanitizing our desires. It basically means giving up any desire that death could get in the way of.
So if we just, like, detach ourselves from everything that death could take from us, it wouldn't have any power over us. It's like saying, you can't fire me, I quit. But to death?
Yeah, that's the idea. If we only have desires that we can achieve while we're alive, or desires that depend on us being alive, then maybe we can, protect ourselves from the harm of death. But the encyclopedia says this strategy doesn't really work.
How so?
Well, it reminds us that death can harm us not just by stopping us from getting what we want, but also by stopping us from having those desires in the first place.
So even if I get rid of all my desires that death could mess up, I'm still vulnerable to the harm of not being able to have new desires in the future.
Exactly. And living a life without any desires that death could affect, that would be a pretty bleak life. It's like, living in a padded room so you don't get hurt by the outside world. You might be safe, but is it really worth it?
So trying to get rid of all those desires, that's not the answer. Seems like there's no easy way to escape the harm of death.
Yeah, the Encyclopedia isn't saying we should do that. It says that maybe a better way is to, accept that we're going to die, but not let it stop us from living. We can admit that our lives are finite without shutting ourselves off from desires that go beyond our lifetime.
It's about finding that balance between accepting death and still, embracing life.
Exactly. We can focus on goals and desires that we can achieve in our lifetime without giving up on the ones that go beyond it.
So we've explored all these different ways of thinking about death, from whether it's actually a bad thing to like when the harm might even happen, and even if living forever would really be all that great. But the encyclopedia, it doesn't just leave us with all these abstract ideas, right? It gives us some more, I guess, practical advice on how we might actually deal with the reality of death.
Yeah, that's true. It suggests that instead of trying to get rid of all of our desires, the ones that death could affect, which as we talked about is basically impossible, we could focus on cultivating what they call death transcending desires.
Death transcending desires. Okay, that sounds pretty intense. What are those exactly?
Well, they're basically desires that aren't limited to how long we live. They can still be meaningful, still be valuable even after we're gone.
So like wanting your children to have a good life even after you're not around anymore,
Hmm.
or maybe contributing to a cause that will continue after you die.
Yeah, exactly. Those are great examples. The idea is that by focusing on these types of desires, we can find a sense of purpose and meaning that goes beyond, our own individual life.
It's like creating a legacy that lives on after you, a way of making your mark on the world that doesn't just end when you die.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And the encyclopedia, it argues that cultivating these death transcending desires, it can actually help us, feel less scared, less anxious about death.
It's like shifting your focus, right? From what you'll lose when you die to what you can give to the world that will stay, that will last.
Mhm. Right. And it's not just about leaving behind physical things or achievements. It can be about the impact you have on other people, the relationships you build, the values you live by.
So even if we can't avoid death, we can find ways to make our lives more meaningful, knowing that it's coming.
Exactly. And this brings us to another important point that the encyclopedia makes. It's not just about changing what we want, our desires, but also about changing how we think about, time itself.
Okay, I'm listening. How can we change how we see time? It feels like time just keeps marching on no matter what we do.
Well, the encyclopedia says that we often get stuck in this linear view of time, always looking ahead, always thinking about the future.
I'm totally guilty of that.
Yeah.
Always planning, always worrying about what's next.
Yeah, it's a normal human thing to do.
Okay.
But the encyclopedia suggests that we might find more peace by, really appreciating the present moment.
Living in the now, that's very zen.
It is. There's a lot of wisdom in those old traditions by really, by savoring each experience, by being grateful for the beauty and wonder of the world around us, we can free ourselves from worrying so much about time.
So instead of always chasing some future goal,
Yeah.
we can find contentment and meaning in the journey itself.
Exactly. And this change in how we see things, it can help us see death not as this terrifying end, but as just a natural part of life.
It's like, I don't know, like realizing that a flower is more beautiful because it won't last forever.
Mm.
Knowing that it will fade makes us appreciate it even more while it's here.
That's a perfect analogy. And this brings us to, I think, a really important idea to leave our listeners with. We've talked a lot about the bad stuff about death and how to make it less bad. But the encyclopedia reminds us that death can have some good stuff too.
Wait, good stuff about death. That seems, I don't know, a little strange. What could be good about dying?
Well, for one thing, death, it kind of gives our lives shape. It gives us a framework, and within that framework, we can set goals, we can do the things we love, we can make the most of our time.
It's like a deadline that makes us want to, get things done.
Kind of, yeah. And death, it also has a way of showing us what really matters. When we think about our own death, it makes us think about what's really important.
Yeah.
And focus on those things.
It's like that saying, live each day like it's your last. But maybe instead of, doing something big, it's more about appreciating the little things, the people we care about, the things that make us happy.
Right. And death can also be, inspiring. It reminds us that life is precious, that we should really cherish each moment.
Wow. This deep dive has been quite a journey. It's made me think about death in ways I never had before.
Mm-hmm.
And, while it's still something that makes me feel, well, a lot of things, I think I understand the different philosophical ideas about it better now.
Me too.
Hmm.
And I hope our listeners feel the same way. The point of philosophy isn't always to find the right answer, but to make us think, to get us talking, and to help us deal with these big questions about life and death.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to thank you for joining us on this exploration.
Yeah.
And remember, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of life and death.